Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense. Online at pressupinc.com. In some of the thinking I've been doing about Canada while here, in the conversations I've had as well, I've heard Canada described as an ongoing argument, one that never gets settled and is not meant to get settled. Is that a characterization of Canada you agree with? And furthermore, how expressed is that in Toronto?
On the whole, I would agree with it. It is rooted in our endless the eternal recurrence of the question of Canadian identity. So there has been no settled view on what it means to be Canadian in a strong kind of nationalist sense ever. And I doubt there will be one, in part now because things are changing so fast in terms of the population of the country. What it means for the city, I don't know, is as abstract. I think it's a concrete kind of constant renegotiation, recreation of the conditions of urban possibility. So the demographic changes that we're seeing across the country are very pronounced in the cities, and in particular in Toronto. So the waves of immigration, people from East Asia, South Asia, elsewhere in the world, have really changed just the daily street experience of walking in Toronto. And at the same time, because of economic ups and downs, we're currently experiencing a huge boom in high-rise building. Most of it intended for residential, for a condo. So the whole downtown is changing considerably just in terms of that shift. We have never seen in this city the kind of flight from downtown that you witnessed in some of the other North American cities.
It never emptied out. Yeah.
Right. But I think there's going to be, there's already evidence of there's huge population surge in the center of the city.
It's going the other way.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's in this constantly renegotiated city of Toronto we're coming to you today from on Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking today at the University of Toronto with Mark Kingwell. He's a professor of philosophy here at the university. He's also the author of many books, including, to name a few well-known examples, Civil Tongue, The World We Want, Concrete Reveries, a book on consciousness in the city, which is one of my favorites of his. And he's got the most recent essay collection out is Unruly Voices, essays on democracy, civility, and the human imagination. He's also written on subjects, ostensible subjects like trout fishing, subjects like cocktails, is an adept user of Simpsons references, both oblique and direct. So we'll have a lot of ground to cover here, but he's certainly a Torontonian. And tell me, you came... what was the Toronto you first saw as a student at this university when you came first? Right.
So I had been born here in 1963, but didn't live here until 1980. My father was in the Air Force, and we were living all over the country. So I had a fairly big appreciation for Canada as a country, and yet had never seen my hometown except on flying visits. In 1980, it was a much smaller city, a much whiter city. It wasn't still, fortunately for an undergraduate, the old Toronto the Good of Sunday closing and anti-liquor laws and all these kind of Anglican hangovers. No hangover. Yes. So it was a lively city, and there's a great music scene, and my life centered around the university campus. But it's, luckily for us, it's right downtown, and the city flows through it and around it. Yes. So it was a decidedly urban experience. It was the biggest place I'd lived to that point in my life.
You can't really draw a line between living on campus and living in Toronto, can you?
No, and it's a great feature of our city that we've been able to preserve this carved out chunk of green space and architecture in some of the most valuable land in the country. And that you are minutes away from the fashionable shopping areas, but also the center of finance downtown on Bay Street, and all the life of the city in every dimension is right there on your doorstep.
Was Toronto the first, how to put it, was it the first sustained city experience you'd had?
I come from smaller cities, Winnipeg out on the prairies, and but I would say yes. It was the first time I started even thinking about myself in terms of urban experience and realizing how much I loved cities, and that I would want, ideally, always to live in a large, diverse city if I had the chance.
And diversity, it's hard to do better than Toronto, especially within Canada, for diversity. I mean, in those standards, by the standards of the world as well, but especially in Canada, you can't get more diverse, can you?
Hardly. Yeah, I think it's the changes to the sort of everyday experience are considerable. If you, I mean, you can choose to cloister yourself and live inside a bubble of homogeneity, but if you walk anywhere, if you go to a sporting event, go shopping, you will see every kind of costume of, every style of dress, every color of skin, hear languages. I mean, just walking around the campus itself has had a huge influx of students, both Canadians and foreign students, change the demographics. I should say, a lot of people complain about the kind of pro forma praise of multiculturalism.
Yes, it was going to come up.
Right.
Yes.
And as a policy, as an official policy, it has been much disputed, and I think there's much to deplore as a policy. But as a reality, just a lived reality of a changing nation, 21st century nation, 21st century city. I don't like the term postmodern, but the sense of newness that this is, and it's viable. I mean, there are tons of problems we can talk about.
Sure.
But it's functioning. We're actually succeeding in living together in a relatively efficient and amiable way.
It is impressive for that. And if you bring up Toronto just outside Canada, I would say if people know something about it, and they usually do, they know multiculturalism, or they just know it's very diverse. They might not know it's officially diverse. But they also bring it up in terms of, well, how to put it, the identity of not having an identity. Toronto is almost an archetypal city made real to some people. Maybe people who haven't spent a lot of time here, arguably. But why does Toronto have the reputation of being almost a generic city somehow executed in life?
Yeah, that's well put. I understand why people have that reaction. And it partly is a matter of being visitors only. Because I think if you live here for a while, you don't have that view. And in part, the big difference is neighborhoods. And the fact that it is a city of neighborhoods. You become very attached to the sort of 16 or 24 square blocks that make up your neighborhood. And they all have names and identities very particular to themselves. So they're stitched together loosely at the edges and don't come together as an overarching urban identity any more than the nation does. That's one thing. The other thing about the generic quality is that it's a sort of feedback loop. Toronto masquerades as New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, whenever the film industry from the U.S. wants to shoot for cheap. So you've seen us in your films and thought it was New York, or were told it was New York, but actually it was Toronto.
Yes, there's that cinematic sense as well, but I wonder, Los Angeles itself, even if Toronto has stood in for parts of Los Angeles sometimes in some productions, Los Angeles has the same issue where it stands in for so many other cities. And it's something I've given a lot of thought to since I lived there. I mean, the parallels now between Toronto and Los Angeles, many have become clear to me. First of all, the diversity of them, even though there's no official multiculturalism there, the importance of neighborhoods, the sense that it is a derided city by the rest of the country. I mean, do you think that still holds true? There's still the derision of Toronto?
Oh, yeah. It's widely hated from coast to coast in Canada, mocked for thinking itself the center of the universe. It's a standard charge.
Were you inoculated against that by being from Toronto at all?
In a strange way, as most young people searching for identity, it helped me to set myself apart. So I could wear my fan jersey for the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team out in Winnipeg, and that way I kind of countered the knee-jerk objections to Toronto.
Right.
So I always saw myself, because I'd been born here, as having that sort of little exit strategy.
You always felt Torontonian.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
I think, the LA comparison is interesting because one big difference that I see between those two cities with similar issues is that Toronto still, in large places, is a good walking city. And, the rap against LA typically is that you have to drive everywhere.
I see what you mean, although I would add this nuance to it. Toronto is a good walking city not because places are good to walk in, but because you can walk between places. Los Angeles, within places, you're fine walking. It's sometimes the places are not contiguous with each other.
Right. I think that's well put too. This is not Manhattan. It's not like there's a genius on every street corner restaurant and 10 visual stimuli per block and so on. But I'm a great lover of walking in cities, and Toronto's always struck me as unjustly neglected as a walking city.
I see. What do you experience walking here? I want to get a sense maybe of what you've experienced over time walking here, what a walk in Toronto is to you now versus what it was as a student versus in the midpoint somehow.
Yeah. Well, as I said, my ambit was pretty narrow when I was a student, and I think that's typical, that your life is centered on class, and if you live off campus, even to go a few blocks is a long way.
Right.
But I lived in a great neighborhood called Kensington Market, which is indeed a market, and cheap rents for students in those days. And so I walked through that neighborhood every day and saw the fishmongers and the old-fashioned European butchers and the cheese.
That is now a food paradise.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yes.
It was more, if you like, ethnic then, less hipster. I mean, there was no hipster culture yet.
Sure, yes. Hadn't been invented.
Yeah.
It was something else. Hipster culture took what form in that time?
Oh, I don't know. Sort of just whatever we meant by cool. I mean, I think it was still some traces of 60s style counterculture, if anything. But yes, the walking for me now, I think about it a lot, and it's what I didn't notice then and have since is the topography of the city. It's a city that's on a lake shore, and it's actually contoured by a series of creeks and rivers that flow down through the city area and form ravines. And those ravines and the green space around them are really the sort of the declivities of the city. And when you add that into your pedestrian life, you get a whole different kind of, built order, natural order kind of tension going on. And it's fascinating. I think I can credit a moment for this in one of, it may have been her first novel, Margaret Atwood's novel, The Edible Woman. She talks about how the main character is just wandering in these ravines, and she comes across various sort of strange people, including a graduate student. And she asked him, are all your friends graduate students? And he says, yeah, isn't everybody? So this idea of the graduate student wandering endlessly in the ravine has stayed in my mind.
The ravine is a mystical place. I didn't realize that was a concept here in Toronto when I got here, but in conversations and looking over the literature, I realized the ravines do have that sort of, there's an element of fantasy to them, isn't there?
Yeah, and when you think about the literature that's set here, certain things feature hugely in that. So the Don Valley, which is still got a river, a sluggish brown river, but which separated the main part of Toronto from the east side for years, and the building of the Bloor Viaduct, which is the main subway and car bridge, features in the fiction of Michael Ondaatje.
Of course.
And so this and then there are other places in Catherine Bush's fiction, for example, the ravines are there. So yes, there's this kind of recurring literary trope anyway.
It's true. And the Don Valley it seems to have become, just for every Torontonian, a psychological divide that is even greater than the geographical divide. People will say, you can live pretty far west and you're considered close to downtown. You can live a little far east, but as long as you're over that line, psychologically, you're far away. Is that the case?
Absolutely the case, yeah. I live in Cabbagetown, which is really the last neighborhood east before you hit the valley. There's a farm and a graveyard and so on, but basically it's the edge of the valley. And there's a big divide there. In fact, a constant complaint, this is so intramural, but it's interesting to us here, a constant complaint from people who live on the east side is that there is no recognition at all, that there's a life over there, that all of the Toronto stuff is centered on the west side and downtown. And so if you go to Leslieville or some of the other east neighborhoods, I'm always kind of surprised. This sounds terrible, but it's like, wow, they have their own restaurants out here. They eat. They have houses and apart from the beach,
they walk like men.
Yes, right, exactly. So I mean, we used to go to the beach out way out Queen East, but that was kind of a destination. You sort of hopped over the stuff in between.
Yes.
It's like the flyover states in the U.S.
Sure. You have to sort of wormhole your way through it. I mean, tell me, I mentioned your book, Concrete Reveries on Consciousness and the City, from a few years back, and how did thinking about cities enter into your philosophical project? How does that book fit into your sort of wider philosophical project?
Well, it was a confluence really of two things. One was a longstanding interest in phenomenology, which is, roughly speaking, the subfield of philosophy that engages consciousness as a subject, and a growing interest on the other hand in architecture, and having new colleagues in architecture, and what I realized was there was kind of latent virus in my mind that had been put there by Karsten Harries, who's a great philosopher of architecture and art at Yale, with whom I'd studied, but I hadn't really thought I was that interested in architecture. But I realized that the way to pursue this strange conjunction of interests was to think about the city as itself a problem of consciousness, and using lots of different metaphors about the mind-body problem, traditional philosophical problems, but also systems theory, circulation metaphors, and at the back of it, really, this ancient Aristotelian idea about walking and peripatesis. So it all started coming together, and that book gestated over some years. Many of the pieces in it were published in different places, and then I kind of gathered them and repurposed them to try to grapple with the question of, the basic, what is a city?
Toronto is not, there's not a huge focus on Toronto in that book. New York has its own section as the capital of the 20th century, and Shanghai is the capital of the future. But is there more Toronto in that book than we would think? I guess in terms of the conception of that book, does Toronto have the influence on that book one would suspect because of your time here?
Undoubtedly, it does. I'm not sure I could say myself exactly what that is. I wrote substantial chunks of the book while I was living in New York, so that was, part of that. And I had also, just a couple of years before that book came out, published a book about the Empire State Building. So I went from focus on a single building and its history of cultural effects, political effects, to thinking about cities. And I realized I didn't just want to write about New York. I'd been sent to Shanghai to write a feature for Harper's Magazine, and it struck me that these two formed a really interesting, not original to me, but a very rich in possibility comparison. Right. Toronto might be the middle term in some ways. I don't want to make it too pat, but it has elements of the sort of Manhattanization that Rem Koolhaas talks about. The press of commerce on the rise into the sky. It isn't, on the other hand, as futuristic as Shanghai by a long toss, but it has elements of, the Asian century. In strict diversity, New York may be more diverse, but there are more Asians in Toronto than there are per capita, per population in New York. And that's a result of Hong Kong and the influx of money through Vancouver and money and people.
I would argue that Toronto is diverse, not in the way New York is diverse, but in the way Los Angeles is, in that it's more of a geographically based diversity, where people mix, of course, but they're not forced to mix in the way New York does it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that goes back to this issue of the Canadian identity question. We have always liked to say that we don't enforce a kind of melting pot or a singular identity. There's instead a cultural mosaic. These are the metaphors that I was indoctrinated into growing up.
Cultural mosaic.
But there's truth to it. And it is the case. You go to, say, Queen Street East and you find Little India. You go out to the West End and there's a Somali community. You go to Markham in the north, vast Chinese community, mainland Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese.
I was at the Pacific Mall the other day, and that was, I kind of want to go back.
Yeah. So this is very typical of how it's happened in this city, as I guess in some others. But that is certainly true here.
What does it speak to in our thinking when we debate over whether a city, Toronto, Los Angeles, what have you, when we debate whether a city is world class?
We've tried to move past this rhetoric because for I'd say a solid decade or more, it was the great stumbling block in our conversation about our own location.
Is it in itself meaningful, that term?
I don't think so. I don't. I mean, maybe it's my prejudice against the kind of slightly pathetic aspirational quality of calling yourself that.
Yes.
And that really was very much the insecurity of the Toronto of 15 years ago,
Right.
it seems to me. That it's, if you're world class, you don't have to say so.
It's true, and Toronto does seem to have moved past it. This is mostly references I'm reading in older books, And Los Angeles, too, in the 60s, 70s, right after the war, was very much, are we world class? Do we need more museums? When the subway gets in, are we going to be world class? Like, as if there was a line you cross, right, to become world class, but there is no line.
Yeah, no. And I think the worst parts of it for Toronto were things like a sort of unseemly chase after certain celebrity architects to get museums designed, so that we could say, well, like this other city, we have a building by blank, instead of just looking at what might make for the best and most beautiful and most functional building.
Right.
And that's just, it's just a feature of a certain growth. I mean, in a way, it's a good sign that it's an anxiety that you get past because it's a transitional anxiety. And once, I don't know that there is a threshold. I agree with that. But once you get past needing to think that way, then you can sort of relax and be as great as you want it to be.
Now, when I read your work, I think of it, I approach it as sort of philosophy used as a nexus for many other subjects. Do you think that cities, or the subject of the city, is similarly a nexus for many other subjects? It always seems to me to be one of the best connectors. If you're talking about cities, you can talk about anything. But do you think that's true, and do you think it works that way for philosophy too?
It's a good question. I do think it's true about cities. I mean, my particular interests more recently have been about public space, specifically, and specifically, more specifically, public spaces as democratic places. And so the idea of the city as a site of justice, which is as old as Plato's Republic, if not older, gets reinvigorated and acquires new urgency. And so the city is then an occasion for deep philosophical thought in a long tradition. But it also has practical consequences because it might actually be as particular as whether the park has a gate on it or not in your neighborhood. So things like that, I think, are very rich in terms of making the city sort of the jumping off point to a deeper kind of reflection. Philosophy, not everybody obviously does philosophy in this manner. But it always had frustrated me to some degree that political theory, which was my subdiscipline when I came out of graduate school, was so relentlessly abstract that even though concerning the matters of the greatest import, how we live together with each other, seemed to have no material awareness whatsoever. It was as if it was trying to describe procreation without talking about sex. And I thought, that can be immensely powerful intellectually. But what about making that come into contact with the built environment or the real lived experience of citizens? And I found for me that's a very rich approach. The stuff, the Simpsons references or pop culture is more in the way of sort of mind candy, right? It's like to get people interested and also to more seriously, maybe to see the concreteness of that.
Right. Is it candy or is it a way in?
Yeah, I'm being maybe too pejorative of my own approach. Yeah, it is a way in, and it gives you a sense of connection to cultural everydayness, right. And that's important because it's not always easy to reach people with what are sometimes quite challenging ideas.
What kind of public space is Toronto rich in?
Well, I think I'll answer negatively first. We lack great parks. We have nothing on the order of the great civic achievement of Central Park or any of the other Olmsted parks.
Is a Central Park possible in this century?
I doubt it, frankly. The real estate developer nexus is just too powerful. Sure. But which makes it even more valuable to see how that was. You feel the city sort of pressing in on every side of Central Park, and it's saying, no, this is going to be dedicated public space. I think we do small parks quite well here. We have done. There's Queen's Park, which is really part of the University of Toronto campus. We're on either side of it. And then small sort of neighborhood out-of-the-way places but in general, you have to rely on for larger kinds of natural things, the ravines again. this sort of
yes, the majesty of the ravine.
Yeah.
But I also hear, I don't hear it in terms of majesty, but I hear people with very, very, words of praise, is it kind words? I hear Torontonians give words of esteem to Nathan Phillips Square as a public space. How do you see it?
I'm conflicted about it. It's if you like concrete, which I do.
But it comes off at first as a caricature of a certain era's public space. Like, here is a public space, we're putting it down, it's in concrete. And it seems like you see a picture and you're like, oh, that's not going to work. Yeah. But I guess it does.
It sometimes does. I don't know. When it was first opened, there was great excitement, and poetry was written about it. Dennis Lee's civil elegies, and I appreciate it for that. But I agree that, and it's a Revell building, the city hall that's in the back of it, which is beautiful, has stood the test of time. I think it's very much a concrete space. It's a space for the rally, for the it's not a welcoming or lounging kind of space. But as that, and especially with the new renovations that they've just completed or almost, I think it succeeds very well. But it's interesting you mentioned the era thing, because it actually appears in an episode of Star Trek, as in the original series, as one of these time travel destinations that one might go to, and you sort of imagine it as so much in that era, the 1970s version of what the future looked like. Looks like.
Nothing, as Robert Hughes said, nothing dates faster than people's visions of the future. Fantasies, he said, and that's an example.
Precisely, yeah. But like I said, I do think the building has held up, just because it's so unusual, and it's I think it has a quality that is very particular now, and like the CN Tower, which is from roughly the same era. It has dated well as a kind of example of what you can do with, concrete and a certain sort of smooth or flanked kind of imagination.
Right. I want to get into the word square here. I mean, it seems like the word square itself is kind of contentious. I know in Vancouver, if you spend much time there, Robson Square is this whole issue with this movement. Where's the square? They call it a square, but there's no square here. And I didn't really think about what defines a square before that, but it really, Vancouverites it angries up their blood, In Los Angeles, there's just something hilarious. I mean, I'm not really a detractor of Los Angeles, nor am I a booster, but I'm very fascinated by the city for reasons sometimes like these. There's parts of Los Angeles labeled squares, named after some luminary that, you can't necessarily place. There's Irv Bloom Square or someone Fielding Square. But they're just intersections. They're literally just road intersections with signs that say Irv Bloom Square, as if that meant, what do you think a square is? What is a square to you?
That's great. Well, I think we've got sort of in between versions of that. So our recent controversial square is Dundas Square, which is basically just an intersection with one corner cut off. And it was the way the corner was repurposed as open space / public space.
So you get kind of a triangular public space?
Yeah. And it's banked up. So architecturally, it's quite interesting. Visually very lively down there, a lot of electronic signage. It's probably the one tiny place in Toronto that feels even a little bit like Shanghai or Hong Kong. I like it, frankly. I like it a lot. And there are events there, and it's got a kind of concert stage feeling that I quite like. The other one that I like, and it's literally a square, is David Pico Square, which is a really small park carved out of the inside of a bunch of buildings right downtown, and a civic kind of place. And it's used by office workers, but it's also a place where things are announced, like the Commonwealth Games successful bid, and this kind of it's very civic in its orientation. So those are kind of two examples here. We don't have anything like the just naming of intersection, but I tell you what we do that I find hilarious is every single back lane in the city can be named.
Really?
And so there's a whole sub-industry of picking the names for these little lanes. Sometimes the lane's only half a block long.
Oh, my.
It's an alley, but they all have street signs and names, and they're always grandiose names.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so right near my house, there's one called Prohibition Lane.
Prohibition Lane.
Because presumably there was a bootlegger
oh my God.
along there at some point. There's anyway, it's that sort of funny thing that we do.
Yes. There's a certain type of space that always fascinates me, and you find it a lot in Los Angeles, but it's not public space, nor is it treated like private space. There's just a lot of total square footage of private space, say in downtown towers or elsewhere, that it's not public, but functionally it's public. You can just go in and use it. What do you think? How do you think of that type of space?
It's really interesting. I think about it a lot because most cities are full of it. Lobbies of big office buildings, right. Even lobbies of hotels are not technically public space. They're not, as in economic jargon, non-rival and right. Non-exclusive. I mean, you can be thrown out, but people do use them, and I kind of like that. I mean, I like the fact that you can drop into a hotel and sit for a while.
Right.
Maybe you're kicked out, but
you gotta do something pretty disruptive to be kicked out of a hotel lobby.
Yeah. The one thing I would say though is that often people point to these as evidence of a thriving public sphere, and of course they're not. We have to remember that they're not.
Right. What sphere is thriving in that case?
It's commercial sphere, really. I mean,
right.
They're in between things. Like there's, for example, there is on College Street something called the Mars Center, which is not part of the university, though it has many researchers in it. And there's a series of open spaces, including a food court there. And I've heard people refer to that as a good public space, but it is not a public space.
Right. But people in their brains, it's like their brains regard it as public space and they use it accordingly.
Yeah. And as long as the use is within the acceptable margins, there's no problem.
Right.
I just think sometimes that, it's when push comes to shove that you might see what's really going on and what the lines of true power are.
It's true. And, the better you dress, the more public spaces there are, it turns out, right?
Always. I mean, it's the same thing anywhere. It's the person who gets the upgrade on the airplane, the better table at the restaurant, all of that kind of thing. It's interesting to play with these ideas. I for example, I used to wear suits every day to work. I wore a suit to work every day for 10 years. These days, I tend more towards jeans and T-shirts. And I absolutely notice the difference.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
What jumps out to you as a difference, or what you think you can do on a suit day versus on a jeans and T-shirts day?
Well, you get fewer questions or looks in certain places. So I remember walking into a function at the Royal Ontario Museum after the Daniel Libeskind renovation, the Crystal, and it was some kind of cocktail reception to which I had been invited. Right. But the security guard stopped me anyway, and I looked around and I realized, of course, everybody else was wearing suits.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
that's what they're watching out for. It's interesting, in Los Angeles, something happened with that city. Maybe it was in the conception of the city itself, where no one's on very sure footing as to who is who, and in some ways, maybe that guy dresses terribly because he can, so maybe you should let him in. They still respect a suit, but at the same time, there's almost a reverse suspicion, like, why do you have to wear a suit? Are you not that important? It's sort of screwed up in that way. Like, it's hard to play that game. In Toronto is a bit easier in that sense.
Well, yeah, I think it's a much more conservative city. It seems to me that in Los Angeles, that must have a lot to do with the fact that the film and music industries are there, and
it couldn't hurt in that sense. Yeah.
Just alternative bases for wealth and power than what's typical here, which is finance, law, business, and so conservatively sartorial, and it certainly is here. And the only kind of differences you would see there are the predictable ones, like the art world, where at an art opening you might think that the person who resembles a homeless man turns out to be the featured artist or something.
Yes,
like
that can happen. Yeah. I suppose it can happen in any metropolis, but Toronto I often hear as well described, besides being multicultural, besides being a city without identity specifically, as being a city, people frame it, they don't describe it. They say that it's like an averaging out of a couple other cities, or if you took this city and added this city and a little bit of this city, that's Toronto. A friend was saying to me recently, he lived in Toronto. He was grew up in Toronto a little bit, or maybe lived there when young, went to New York in search of sort of the action of New York. Didn't think it was to his taste, found it too dirty, a little bit too just troubling on many levels to stay there. And he came back to Toronto, and he's like, this is what I like about Japan. Japan is very, very orderly, and I appreciate that. And if you took a dose of Japan, gave it to New York, maybe you'd have Toronto. But when I go to Japan, I always notice the vending machines outside, in public space, everywhere. Big cities, small cities, hamlets, vending machines with good stuff, well-maintained, advanced vending machines. And every expat I talk to there, European, Canadian, American, whatever, they all say, if that was in my city back home, they would be destroyed overnight. It bothers me less the possibility of that happening in America than why are we convinced, Americans, Canadians, that vending machines would just get destroyed if put out. Do you know what I mean? Like that assumption.
Right. You're right on the first point, by the way. There's a whole series of these that people collect over the years. I think it was Peter Ustinov that said Toronto is like New York, run by the Swiss.
The famous line.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of my favorite, more recent ones was an eccentric billionaire played by Steve Martin on 30 Rock invites the Liz Lemon character to move to Toronto with him, and he says, "You love Toronto. It's like New York without all the stuff."
Yes, I heard that one sided. Or Marge Simpson saying, "It's so bland and unassuming. I'm home."
Yeah, right. So, so those things are unarguable, I suppose. On the question of the sort of the public trust or compliance, you might say, right? The collective action. In some ways it's the a version of the broken window syndrome, right? If you see the first graffito, if you see the first dent in the vending machine, that sort of gives you permission. And changes in culture like that, if it is a change in culture, I mean, you're raising the question: is it really the case that it would happen, or
yeah, I'm not sure it is. Yeah. But we think, and they never say, oh, people would steal the drinks. They don't say somebody would live in it. I don't know. They just say it would get destroyed as if it was in itself satisfactory to just smash it. And I mean, why do we all think that? I wonder.
Well, I guess in the United States, certainly there is a cultural bias in favor of the sort of, aggressive individual who would somehow not prepared to be cowed by the assumption of order that leaves things in place. On the other hand, I mean, I see tons of good collective behavior among Americans everywhere you go.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it occurred to me when I was in Korea recently for 6 weeks. That country is not law-abiding. It's orderly in its way, but not because they follow the law. They follow social rules. America, we worship the law as if it were our religion, and maybe it is, but we still kill each other a lot. And so, I'm not quite sure how to explain American legal piety versus our behavior.
Right. These are tricky questions. It strikes me that the Canadian variant on this is some deep conservative respect for all forms of authority, especially legal authority, but also with a kind of passive-aggressive, resentful quality that erupts at uncertain moments. So it sort of builds and builds, and then the next thing you know, it's like a fight in hockey. There you
Down go the gloves.
Yeah. And in fact, I would say, going back to Toronto and its appearance to people who come to visit, a lot of people tell me, "Oh, I love Toronto. The people are so polite." And this is this long-standing cliche about it.
Sure.
And I think people are anything but polite here. They may be relatively well-mannered, but that's only because they haven't got to the point where they're erupting yet.
The meter is still low. It hasn't been maxed out.
That's right. So
what happens when a Canadian erupts?
Well, and all this bubbling resentment, you get, we don't tend to kill each other with handguns because we don't have them for the most part. But, there's a sort of resort to law. I mean, it's a very litigious nation in some ways.
So is America. That's what I think of sometimes as the main problem in America is lawsuit. Life is almost about lawsuits in America. If you really get down to it, everybody in the back of their mind is thinking of who they could sue and thus make their fortune, as if that were an industry.
Yeah.
It is for the lawyers.
Right. Yeah. I'm fascinated by this stuff because, I mentioned walking, and I love to walk in the city, but like all walkers, I have my pet peeves, people who are looking at their handheld devices I sometimes resolve to myself that I'm going to walk into the next person who doesn't look up to negotiate the passage, because that's an act of citizenship, and I rarely do. I mean, sometimes I graze them. But I found myself a couple of weeks ago on the receiving end of one of these, and it wasn't because I was looking at a device. I don't have one. I was trying to move around two slow slower people in front of me. And this guy came roaring up alongside, and he just gave me the full shoulder body slam.
Really?
Yeah. And I thought, wow, I'm the miscreant. I'm supposed to be the person meting out the punishment. So then we didn't have any further body contact, but we had, a pretty serious yelling match where a lot of rude language was exchanged on the sidewalk. That's not usual for me or for the city, but
right. This is more how you describe New York in Concrete Reveries, as you've got to be with the program walking. Toronto, it seems like is there a program that you have to be with while walking? It's not to go fast, but what is it to do? Yeah,
I don't think so. And with the exception of Fifth Avenue, which is now almost non-negotiable because of people looking at their hands, the New York imperative still holds, and that is efficiency and speed. And so there is a sense in which, I'd like to talk about the lots of people have Jane Jacobs, Michel de Certeau, the concourse of Grand Central Terminal, and these endless, minute negotiations of shared space. And everybody's got a plan. Everybody's going somewhere, but you can't walk in a straight line. So, Jacobs describes it as a dance. It's a kind of, and if you stop at one of those balconies overlooking the concourse and just sort of close your ears you can start hearing Strauss music or something. And, the Toronto program isn't as elegant or as directed as that. I think there's a mixture. That's part of the problem. So you've got people who are, very, very, go, go, go. And then a lot of kind of sauntering. And that's especially true right around here at the university, because you've got people lost in thought, or groups of people, students having conversations.
Yes, 5 alongside each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
If you went further downtown, and especially at the end of the workday, there's a kind of mad rush to the train station for all these commuter trains. And God forbid you should be trying to head uptown at that point when the tide of people is sweeping down towards Union Station.
What important element of Toronto don't you see when you walk?
I've been chided for saying this, but it's true. The erotic.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I guess you wouldn't. Yeah. I mean, I hear that Toronto in the 60s, 70s was sort of you'd encounter the sort of tame erotic businesses along the street, and it was a fun element of what the city was. Their day seems to have passed, those places.
And I wasn't even thinking of institutions. I was thinking about those little exchanges between people, glances.
You don't get your eyes met for anything, really, erotic or otherwise.
Yeah, no, you really don't. It's a strange feature that becomes noticeable only when you go somewhere else where it is more the custom. New York is a good example. I mean, if people aren't looking again at their devices, they'll meet your eye in all kinds of ways, appraising, but also, and I mean erotic then in the general sense, the sense of kind of, there's a little charge in the air because we're both humans here and we're passing, and we're never going to be any closer than we are right now. And I find that invigorating. I mean, in Toronto, no, there's no eye contact, and that's it's unfortunate. It seems like it's an aspect of everyday life from which pleasure can be derived that we don't have here. Now, I should say, of course, that there are problems with this idea of the gaze and, objectifying and so on. And there might be many people who prefer it this way. I'm just not one of them.
It's true, but I feel like you choose the right city to compare, and Toronto looks pretty good. I mean, Vancouver, there's sort of the legendary steel walls people have around them there. Jan Morris has written a lot about Canada incisively, and she has what she calls the smile test in various cities around the world, and just smile at a stranger, see what they do, and famously wrote that Vancouver performed worse than any other city. And so Toronto's not doing so bad in that respect, is it?
Right, I didn't know that about Vancouver.
Yes.
So, I mean, what she said about Toronto was, it's not first best in anything, but it's second best in a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, second prize Toronto.
Yeah, so it's a whole bunch of silver medals that add up to a pretty good tally. And I think a lot of us are pretty convinced that that's a good deal.
Yeah, it's true, because it is being in first place for something means you need to endlessly defend the first placiness of it by keeping building taller or just jacking up whatever it is that makes you first place until it's not so good anymore. But with what was I was describing the smile test, and then the second prize nature of Toronto in that essay, and she wrote in 1984, talked about a visit she made in 1954, And now we're 30 years past 1984, so there's another comparison there to be made. But in the 50s, she said the city was white, and she described the people as, I love this line, almost incoherently polite. Do you think those days are over as well? I mean, the white days are gone, and that's a good thing for the diversity of Toronto, but that degree of politeness, I guess, what is it people mean when they say that Canadians are polite or Torontonians are polite?
Well, of the era that she was talking about, it was pretty clearly large reserves of Anglican self-effacement and a kind of, at its best, humility, at its worst, a caginess, I suppose, self-repression. Now, I think that has changed considerably, and what people think of or experience as politeness is probably still a certain amount of reserve. I mean, Canadians are not typically demonstrative, but it's also more of the kind of closing in. And I miss some of the banter of other places. I remember just going to buy a beer at a Cubs game in Chicago, and just the sort of easy kind of almost like a call and response conversation that you have with the person serving you, and it's tiny, it's just a part of this experience. I miss that kind of thing here. People don't strike up conversations.
There's the issue of linguistic common ground, which in Los Angeles is also pronounced.
Right. True enough. And so there is that. So you don't you hesitate, I suppose, to sort of break into somebody else's bubble. Right. I hope it's not a wall like in Vancouver, but it's a bubble for all kinds of reasons. So that's often experienced by people as politeness. But I think it's really. And sure it is. I mean, it's functional in the sense of say, etiquette, right? It's not the kind of warm regard that is the mark of true civility, in my view. I mean, this goes back to some other work of mine on that distinction between politeness and civility. Civility, it seems to me, is a far richer concept about taking the other seriously and making room for the other, not just going around, which is what mere politeness often is.
Civility seems like a strong suit of Toronto. Is it or is it not?
I'm not sure. I have hopes, and I'd like to see more of it. And I think we've done some things quite well, and we continue to do so. But maybe what we need is, a crisis to really push us somewhere.
How about a crisis?
Well, I don't know. I thought when we had arguably the worst mayor in the history of North America that would do it, but I was wrong about that.
Right. Well, that's a mayor you've written about in the media a bit as well. I mean, what position on him are you comfortable taking publicly?
Well, he was a terrible mayor. I mean, he's still officially mayor until our election. Right. He's an acknowledged drug addict and alcoholic and consorter with criminals, and proud of it. I mean, this is the thing that. But also mendacious and ill-judged and focused on various fallacious talking points to the detriment of actually making the city better.
Yeah, he is a mystery to people outside Canada, indeed outside Toronto, indeed inside Toronto, I think, for the most part. But I hear him, when you ask the simple question of why is Rob Ford your mayor, people in Toronto, in the core of Toronto, will always say, oh, well, the suburbs put him there. Recent immigrants put him there. They'll say that if they're being especially candid, but they'll say they will blame the suburbs, and if they have a historical argument, they'll say, well, Toronto got amalgamated in the 90s. It's too big. There's people who are resentful of cities by their very nature who are now officially Torontonian. That's why Rob Ford is mayor. Is that why Rob Ford is mayor? Does it speak to something deeper?
There is some truth to that. This is what we call sometimes the 905 versus 416, which are two area codes. 416 is the old city of Toronto, the downtown neighborhoods. But there were lots of people, both geographically downtown and further up the sort of social and income and status scales who voted for Rob Ford because they thought he was going to bring a change. And
which was what? Change.
Theoretically, it was fiscal responsibility. But of course, that hasn't happened despite his claims. And what we got instead was somebody who's actually himself hostile to the idea of cities. He thinks people shouldn't be riding bikes on the streets of a city. The streets are for cars and trucks.
He did preside over the removal of a bike lane. Yeah. Also over sort of pie-in-the-sky subway schemes, too, so there's that.
Yeah, I mean, there is, it's an endless debate, really, but The one thing that I would say, in addition to the historical stuff, which, as I said, is only partly accurate, there's a structural thing here, which is that the mayor of Toronto was really just one member of council. And what that means is the public face of the mayor is disproportionately important because the mayor himself or herself doesn't actually have that much power. What would be great to see, not with the Rob Ford case, but with someone else with true leadership and vision, would be a more powerful kind of mayoral opportunity. And you think of it doesn't just have to be the mayor, of course. You think of, the great changes in other cities, LaGuardia, Lindsay, Giuliani, if you favored his program, actually changing the face of the city. And we have had mayors with vision and charisma. Maybe we'll get one again.
I do hear the mayors of Toronto described in usually pretty extreme terms, like, I hated that one, loved this one, hated that one. It's sort of, I guess this is the nature of politicians to divide, but is it especially true in Toronto by Canadian standards?
I'd say it is, in the sense that we have our sort of very divided politics at the federal level, but it's all personal here, right? Because at this level, municipal level, party membership is not in play. So it's very much your visceral personal response to the figure of the mayor. And the fact that somebody might be a non-entity in your view gives you a pretty extreme position with respect to that. I also think that it goes back to something that we discussed, which is this is a whole bunch of different towns or villages within a municipal boundary, by and large. And there's a big difference about how you even see the idea of Toronto if you live, say, in Leaside or in Scarborough versus if you live in the Annex or Swansea, to take some of our neighborhoods. You just have a very different mental idea of Toronto and your place in it. So that clearly plays into mayoral politics, council politics.
Is walking always your main way to observe a city you haven't known before? Is that the basis of your getting to know a city?
Yeah, absolutely. Partly it's a function of necessity. When I go somewhere, I usually have been flying and maybe jet lagged, and one of the best things I know is to get out and start walking, especially if the sun is shining. And I've had that great pleasure, all over the world, from Sydney to Doha to Shanghai to every major city in Europe, pretty much. And I love it. I love it. In Toronto, I also like very much the bike, because one of my students wrote an essay that argued that the bike was the perfect speed for experiencing the street. It's a little too fast for me, because when I get on the bike, I get sort of urgent. Yeah. But if you have the leisurely bike ride, if you can do that in all the traffic, gives you a beautiful kind of, you're not really participating, and you're sort of flowing along past the sidewalks, but you're also taking everything in, and you're in the air. You're not in the enclosed space of the car.
It's good speed to learn a city, certainly.
Yeah.
Because the car is a bit of a, it's not quite the wormhole that a subway is, where you go in one point, come out another, but you really don't. You're perceiving a linear pathway, and you're perceiving the point you began at and the one you ended at. Walking, you get the finest grain of observation.
Yeah, I agree, and that is definitely my favorite mode, virtually anywhere. And to alter your route even slightly in a place that you think you know well can offer up all kinds of unexpected gifts of visual stimulus or insight even. You come across a store maybe that you've never seen before, never heard of. If your city's big enough and diverse enough, there's always something new to learn about it. One of the things I do, and this is probably fairly unusual, take a subway or streetcar, say, to a neighborhood I don't know, and then spend some time there walking. Because it's true that sometimes the distances themselves become impracticable. Right. So it's a great thing to explore your own place in that way.
Are there cities you've walked around and just immediately thought or recognized that this is a different conception of the city than any of the cities I've been in? Ones where it seems it's still a city, it's still a world city, but ones that just express the concept of cityness very differently from what you're used to.
That's a good question. I think that Yeah, because if you go to, say, Shanghai, it's just more of that, right? More of the city. If you're used to big or biggish cities.
Yeah. If you like big cities, check out the giantest city you'll see.
Right. So it's just kind of more of the same, hyped up, amped up. Right. I would say Doha, actually. It's,
really?
Just the physical, geographical experience, the lack of people on the street, and of course the way people are dressed, the lack of skin, and then the souk in the middle, and this feeling of kind of an ancient organizing principle of the souk as the meeting place, still holding in this rather large urban environment, and the corniche, which gives it its kind of natural setting, being kind of beach without users. Although there are people who go there, but it's so I think that's the way it's spread out, and to come upon, for example, on a Friday night, I guess it is, when all the guest workers from India and Pakistan get off work and they go to trade for these movie star cards and knockoff videos, and this kind of pop-up impromptu mixture of community center and marketplace. I don't, you can see things like that, but the idea that there's this whole hidden class of workers, all men, there's not a woman for blocks and blocks around, doing this kind of trading and, living this life, which is really utterly unlike anything else. So, and of course, other places in the Middle East, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, there are these, huge populations of virtually invisible guest workers who are doing all that work,
Right. You never think of them if you haven't been to the city, but if you have been, they're hard to avoid. And this idea of a central public space, does a city need a center, and does that center need to be a public space?
I'm not sure need is the right word. I've been influenced in thinking about this by Aldo Rossi, for example, who talks about monumentality and the idea of the monument as the place that establishes a center, if not the center. And the monument for him isn't just an architectural form. It doesn't have to be a large building or a statue or anything. It can be virtually anything that acts as this kind of gathering of the space and redeploying of the space. And I think all cities have those. And they do need them in a sense, but there doesn't have to be just one. And it doesn't have to be a public space either, because I think that it can be something like, a landmark that allows people to orient themselves to the city, and that is in some very meaningful way still the center, even if it's not a grand park or public building.
What does it mean that here, outside of City Hall, the CN Tower has got to be that for Toronto? What does it mean that a pod on a spear at the south of the city, a very tall one, and I like the design a lot. I think everybody seems to have warmth in their hearts for the CN Tower, but what does it mean that kind of a structure is that for Toronto?
Yeah. Well, it plays back into several things that we've talked about, that in a way, and of course it's true, that absolutely is the monument of this city. I love it. I've always loved it since I was a kid, and the first time I went up there, I actually resolved just the other day to go up again as soon as possible, because I realized I hadn't been up in more than a decade. And so it's ever present. But it's right on the far south edge of the city. It's practically on the lakeshore. And so what does that say about us? Well, that our center is not at the center, that there is no center. It's not Gertrude Stein on Oakland. There's no there. But it's more like, well, we like this kind of looking up, and we know it's there, and it tells us which way is that way and which way is this way, but we're going to get down to our business down here at ground level.
What did you learn in the CN Tower the last time you were up there looking, or the first time looking down at Toronto? And what do you expect to learn something different about Toronto the next time you go up?
Well, the first time it was the highest I'd been in the air, not in an airplane.
Oh, yes.
When it was still the tallest freestanding structure in the world, as they like to say. And so it was just exciting as a Canadian, especially for me, because I had this then still notional identity as a Torontonian, to kind of take possession of that experience. And I've always really liked observation decks, towers, also rotating restaurants or bars. And so it was just sheer wonder, to be honest. But I was very young on one of those flying visits. Now I'd be especially interested to see from that vantage the changes in the skyline, the huge amount of building that's happening down on the shore, but also the north and east and west expansion. So we have carved out what even in my 20s was farmland and developed the hell out of it for miles and miles. And this is all in contrast to the high-rise stuff happening down near the lake, old style can of worms, suburban developments, but with monster homes rather than tract homes or Levittown style. And that just goes for miles and miles. And I the only times I've really had that view of it have been, on approach from to the airport from somewhere. And I'm looking forward to the feeling of seeing what that looks like, because it's just it's a textbook case in ex-urban sprawl, because there's been virtually nothing to stop it from happening. It just goes and goes.
Right. There's no natural barrier or anything like that. I mean, as Toronto builds both out and up, and as Toronto becomes aware of itself, there seems to be even more reflection on Toronto now than ever before. Do you think Toronto can or should keep playing the role of the sort of real archetypal city?
Inevitably, I think it will keep doing that. I'd like it to take on maybe a more concrete sense of itself. I mean, for those of us who live here and love it, it's still a place where you think about leaving. I'll be honest, do I want to think about New York or San Francisco or even Montreal? Because, most Torontonians who have the means to do so travel to Montreal and love it there, and that European feeling.
Sure.
It doesn't,
the decay.
I mean, it doesn't seem to hold you as tightly as some cities do. Right. Even if you realize, you look up and you realize you spent more than 2 decades here. So I would love to see both in myself, I guess, and that's within my control, but also just in the city in general, a sense of confidence and sort of full forward identity as ourselves alone. The film industry probably can still find good locations here, but
sure.
And we're happy to have them. But it would be nice to see Toronto be itself, I guess is one way to put it. In our fiction, it's there. It's less so in film.
Some forms lag behind others.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's here in the city that's becoming ever more itself, seems to me. Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I've been speaking with Mark Kingwell, professor of philosophy here at the University of Toronto, author of books like A Civil Tongue, The World We Want. There's books on cocktails, there's books on trout fishing, there's concrete reveries, there's the new essay collection. There's plenty out and more to come. Mark, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.